Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Thomson Reuters, The Answer Company. Crutchfield Dermatology, a full-service treatment center and Medi-Spa in Eagan. Their goal is to help you look good and feel great with beautiful skin. With service built around courtesy, dignity, and respect, Mayo-trained Dr. Charles Crutchfield personally treats each patient and is acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. The Minnesota Twins are looking forward to another great season in 2023, led by the return of All-Stars Carlos Correa and Brian Buxton. With the return of numerous players who were injured in 2022 and some new acquisitions, another division crown and a return to the World Series are in their sights. Established in 2007, 45th Parallel Spirits was among the first 50 micro-distilleries in the United States. Based in New Richmond, Wisconsin, all aspects of production occur at our facility. If you're interested in visiting and learning more about the 45th Parallel Distillery, please check our website and plan a visit to tour our facility and taste our spirits. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Access to Democracy. I'm your host today, Steve Francisco. It's my pleasure to invite to our studio today a member of the Minnesota Supreme Court, the Honorable Justice Paul Thissen. Welcome, Justice Thissen, to our program today.
Well, thanks for having me.
So let's get right into it. You've had a lot of broad experience as an attorney before you became a judge. Tell us a little bit about your experience before you went on to the Minnesota Supreme Court.
Sure. So, I worked about 25 years as a lawyer before I went on the court. I was a law clerk myself for a federal judge, but then worked for a firm called Briggs & Morgan, which is now the Taft Law Firm, doing complex business litigation, and also did a couple of years for the Appellate Public Defender's Office, so representing criminal defendants arguing before the Court of Appeals and the court I currently sit on. Mm-hmm. And then in the latter part of my legal career, I worked for Lindquist and Benham, which is now Ballard Spahr. Everybody's changing names these days. But doing healthcare, not litigation, but kind of regulatory and transactional, helping them do deals, mostly in the long-term care area, nursing homes, assisted living facilities, that kind of thing.
And then you come from a legislative background too. So the two branches of our government, or three branches of our government, you've served in the legislative branch, Minnesota Legislature. Tell us about your time in the legislature. Yeah,
well, I was elected from Richfield in South Minneapolis in 2002. So I started in 2003 in the legislature and served there till 2018. I was chair of the Health and Human Service Committee for a while, and so did a lot of work on that, a lot of work on pensions. And then I was elected leader of the Democrats I did that for 6 years, and 2 of those years I was Speaker of the House.
Wow. Very interesting career. And then you were appointed in 2018 by Governor Mark Dayton. You were appointed to the Minnesota Supreme Court, been there ever since, been elected by the voters since then. And isn't this the way it works, that the governor nominates or fills a Supreme Court vacancy, but then you stand for election at the next statewide election? Is that correct?
The next statewide election more than a year after you were appointed.
More than a year.
Yes.
Okay.
So I was appointed in the spring of 2018, didn't have to run until 2020. Right. And then every 6 years.
Right. So aren't you unique right now in the court in the sense that aren't you the only former state legislator currently serving on the Minnesota Supreme Court?
And that's correct. The previous person was Chief Justice Blatz, Kathleen Blatz, had served in the legislature. It's much less common than it used to be. A very common thing in our history, but it's much less common than it used to be.
Right. So would it be fair to say that your legislative experience, certainly your previous legal experience, but your legislative experience in the trenches, so to speak, at the Minnesota House of Representatives, Did that help prepare you for your role as an associate justice on the court?
Well, I think it does. I mean, I think for all judges, people's prior life experience can't help but affect how they kind of do their job as a judge, because a judge is exercising judgment, right? But certainly the legislative stuff helps. A lot of what we do is interpret statutes that the legislature passed. Usually, unfortunately, they're before us because they're not perfectly well written.
Right.
But understanding that process and how legislators go through that and reach decisions and what they're trying to do when they pass statutes, that certainly is helpful. Probably more important, or a bigger impact on me, though, was, I traveled around the state of Minnesota as a legislator for 10 years, for the latter part of my career, meeting with, people all across the state in their, houses and their businesses and their churches, and hearing their stories and what they care about and hope for and are afraid of, for themselves or their families. All of those things, still stay in the back of my mind as I'm, hearing these individual cases. And so that experience is probably the best gift the legislature gave to me, and certainly it impacts, how I do my work now.
And you mentioned statutory interpretation. We understand that's one of the key jobs, is resolving disputes about what does a statute mean. That's how these disputes get to the Supreme Court.
No, that's exactly right. The legislature, passes the law to solve a problem, and then people, if it's not 100% clear, and it's almost impossible that statutes are always going to be clear because you can't anticipate every circumstance. The parties will, have different interpretations of what obligations those statutes put on people, and that comes to us, and that's a big part of our job.
So in November 2019, there was an article I came across in Minnesota Bar Association magazine, and you're quoted, you had an article there titled, "When Rules Get in the Way of Reason, One Judge's View of Legislative Interpretation," and you stated, quote, "A basic challenge of statutory interpretation is making sure everyone stays in his or her lane." Explain further, what did you mean by that?
Well, and this is so important to kind of, for people to understand how our system works, and I think most people generally do. But I mean, really what that's getting at is legislators, are elected by people to kind of come together, and they have the tools to have committee hearings and hear all kinds of voices. An issue, a problem is confronting the state, and legislators can listen to everybody and come up with a solution. They can make policy. And for the most part, courts are not in that job, especially when it comes to statutes. If it's the Constitution or what we call the common law, that might be different. But for statutes, our job is to implement what the legislature said the solution is supposed to be. So our job is really to try to, in some sense, get inside the heads of the legislature and understand what they intended when they did it. And there's lots of tools. Obviously, the words are really important, the words they wrote down, but sometimes those words aren't 100% clear, so you have to look to other sources.
Committee hearings, perhaps, or testimony of legislators.
And we have rules sometimes, and just thinking about what they were trying to accomplish when they passed this statute, what the purpose was, all
which
of that.
Which we call legislative intent.
Yes, we look for legislative intent. And so that's the point, that judges shouldn't be in the job of kind of saying the legislature really screwed up here, and so we're going to impose our own policy preference. That's not our job, and we are very careful not to kind of go down that path.
And a key reason you're careful is you are subject to election from time to time, being on the Supreme Court, but the popular branch of government is the legislative branch, because they're subject to election every 2 years in the Minnesota House and every 4 years in the state Senate.
That's exactly right. It's about democratic legitimacy.
Right. I'd like to ask you, some of our viewers may not really be familiar with the structure of the Minnesota court system. Could you describe for our viewers who maybe have no understanding or have never thought about this, what are the different levels of courts that we have in Minnesota?
Yeah, so we have 3 levels of courts. It's kind of like the federal system, but we have our district courts, our trial courts. They're in every county in the state. And their job there's one judge that's sits in every case, so they don't have anybody to kind of lean on. But it's really in the trial courts where the facts are sorted out, right? The witnesses come in, the jury or the judge can watch them, assess their credibility, listen to the evidence, and decide, because litigation is really two people having different versions of the same story,
right?
And they decide which version is correct. I mean, that's what finding the facts. That's what juries and judges do. And they're very busy places here. 2 million cases a year. All the traffic tickets all the way up to first-degree murder
it's
cases.
That many in Minnesota? 2 million a year.
Yeah,
I didn't realize that.
They're very busy places. And the other thing I just want to emphasize, and I think this is important, we have our 3 branches of government, but the branch that really touches most Minnesota's lives in the most direct way, I think, are our courts, which is why people really should pay attention to what's going on there. If you think about, we deal with family law, right? Our family's going to stay together. We deal
probate
with probate. How are estates going to be pushed out? Obviously, criminal law is really important. Housing, are people going to stay in their house or not? Have a roof over their head? I mean, these very fundamental things.
Taxation, we have our own tax court, right?
Yes, right, we do.
Which, like, if, let's say, hypothetically, the city of Eagan decides to, in my opinion, overvalue my house, meaning I'm going to have to pay higher property taxes, I can appeal that, perhaps, to the tax court?
And all of that happens in our courts. That's exactly right. So, really important. They do the hardest work in the court system. Then there's the Court of Appeals, 19 judges. They hear cases in 3-judge panels, so they kind of decide all 3 of them together. There's 19 of them, and they hear about 2,000 cases a year. So the funnel starts to narrow down pretty quickly. But there is a right. If someone loses in the district court in a trial or in other procedural situations, they get an automatic right to appeal to the Court of Appeals. Then the Supreme Court, there's 7 of us, and we decide all of our cases en banc, so all 7 of us together. We, for the most part, actually get to choose which cases we're going to take. So we don't have to take every case. First-degree murders, we have to hear every one, and there's a couple other areas that we have to.
Because of the potential penalty.
The significance of the penalty. Life in prison.
Right.
And so that's how they, so we hear about 100 to 120, 140 cases a year. So the funnel continues to narrow down.
And Justice Thissen, what is the typical time from the time that the court takes a case and hear oral arguments? How long is it usually until you render a decision?
Well, from the time, so we'll take the case and then the parties file their briefs and then oral argument gets set. So there's some months built in there. But once we hear oral argument, immediately after that argument, where the lawyers come in and present to us and we ask them questions, we go back in a room, the 7 of us, and just the 7 of us, and talk through the case, and we make our preliminary decision, right then and there. It usually takes 3 to 4 months on average to get an opinion out.
Do you find that time period, you've been on the court since 2018, has that time period for the consideration of cases until the court renders a decision, has that time stayed pretty consistent, or do you find it increasing, or is it shortening because of the caseload?
It's been roughly consistent. I mean, we do have cases that take longer than 4 months.
More complex, perhaps.
They can be more complex, more serious, not more serious issues, I shouldn't say that, but more complex issues, right? Yes. And so sometimes they take longer, but it's roughly stayed about the same.
Mm-hmm. How many judges are there in Minnesota at this? Do you have an idea how many district court judges there are? And you mentioned how many are on the Court of Appeals, 7 on the Supreme Court. Do you know how many judges
I should know this, and I don't know for sure. It's a couple hundred, yes.
A couple of hundred.
Yeah.
And they're divided in judicial districts that cover the geography of the whole state of Minnesota.
Yes, that's exact. There's 10 judicial districts, but most judges serve in a particular county within the judicial district.
Normally, the process, as we understand it, is that cases may start at the district court level, then work their way up to Court of Appeals, and then ultimately to the Supreme Court. Are there ever any cases where a case may appear in a lower court, say a district court, that it would bypass the Court of Appeals and go to the Supreme Court? Does that ever happen?
The one first-degree murder cases is the time that happens. So the other cases we take directly are from the tax court and the workers' compensation court, which are kind of unique courts.
Specialty courts.
They come right to us. They don't go to the Court of Appeals. Some cases start in the Court of Appeals. Some agency appeals, they would come to us. So there's different rules. We also hear the other one would be statewide election cases would come.
Which
to
we've
us.
had
Yeah.
a couple of recount cases in our recent Minnesota history, the challenge of
Frank and Coleman and Dayton
Frank
and
Coleman.
Tom Emmer, and yes, we've had a few of them. Yes.
Right, which made a lot of news, but those cases went to the Minnesota Supreme Court and decisions were rendered.
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
Very interesting. So, in case anyone out there is wondering and they're looking and saying, you have a pretty good job, I might aspire to be a Minnesota Supreme Court justice. You've talked about your own background, 25 years practicing law, tenure in the Minnesota Legislature. What other ways would one prepare for a possible appointment or election to the Minnesota Supreme Court?
Well, the only
What qualifications, I guess, is what I'm really looking at.
Right. I mean, the only requirement is that you have to have a law license, so kind of a valid law license, and then anyone can. I mean, and there's two paths to getting there. One, anybody can run in an election, which for us, for the Supreme Court, there's at least one, usually more than one justice up every 2 years, and that's true for the district courts as well. Now, this last year, only one judge in the whole state was actually had an opponent. Strangely, it's usually a little bit more than that, but that's one path. If you're a lawyer with a law license, you can run for any level of court when those elections come up. The other way is through the appointment process, and that is, unlike the federal courts, the governor does make the nomination, but there's no legislative intervention.
So, like the Minnesota Senate, unlike the U.S. Senate, they have a judiciary committee in the state legislature, but
They have
these
no role.
nominees don't go through that. It's the governor's decision.
Yes,
Yeah.
But what's important, I think, for this is maybe sounds not significant, but I really think it is. We actually have a great process in Minnesota, which is called the Judicial Selection Commission, and that is for district court judges, kind of in all districts all across the state. For statewide, there's a different one, but it's a group of lawyers and non-lawyers. When an opening comes up, they apply through the Judicial Selection Commission, and those folks screen all the applications, interview the people, and then make recommendations of usually 3 people to the governor. And the governor, except for the Supreme Court, although all governors kind of follow this process for the Supreme Court anyway, has to choose from those 3 people. So
And
it adds
this is basically a vetting process.
It's a vetting process,
Yeah.
and and I think it also creates some more legitimacy because it doesn't look purely political, right? It's not just the governor picking his or her best friend.
And it's the opinion of other lawyers who practice.
And non-lawyers.
And non-lawyers, too.
So I think it served Minnesota really, really well.
And they're looking for things like judicial temperament. Is this person really suited? They may be a good lawyer, but just because you're a good lawyer doesn't necessarily mean you may be a good judge.
And life experience and, all of these things that go
Contributions to the community, legislative service, other things that may make a candidate uniquely qualified.
Yeah, I think it's really served Minnesota well.
Yeah. So I'd like to talk to you just briefly about the Supreme Court's role in the disciplinary side for attorneys, because the Supreme Court has a very important role in that regard. Would you say a word about that?
Sure, yeah. So we basically sit as ultimately kind of the trial court for all attorney discipline cases. Now, there's a lot of process that happens before that. We have an Office of Professional Responsibility that investigates, and there's panels of lawyers and public that kind of hear cases that become
And we should be
public.
clear, this is allegations of misconduct
Yes,
against
sorry.
attorneys for perhaps misusing client funds or misusing an escrow account or other actions that would
not
warrant
communicating with their clients very well, and being, perhaps being not as competent as they should be,
violating
missing deadlines.
the law.
Well, committing felonies can also,
Right.
yes. So if a client of a lawyer has concerns about how they are represented, they can bring a complaint to the Office of Professional Responsibility. They investigate, vet it, and then some of them, as they make their way through the process, ultimately get to us, and we decide. And our criteria really are, our ultimate criteria is not to punish the lawyer. It's really we want to take precautions to make sure that the public,
Protect the
consumers are protected.
Right,
You know, and so we can impose different kinds of discipline. We can impose, you know, an admonition and encourage someone to do better. We can suspend people for a certain amount of times, and for really, really egregious, you know, misconduct, we can disbar someone from being a lawyer.
What could hypothetically lead to disbarment? I assume it's the most serious violation.
It's largely stealing people's money, committing very serious felonies, lying to the courts and to clients in a repeated way. I mean, those are the types of things
that could lead to disbarment. I was looking at an article in the St. Paul Legal Ledger, and it noted that in 2022, last year, that the court imposed there were 5 disbarments and 33 lesser disciplinary actions, suspensions, or perhaps you have the authority to levy fines against lawyers as well, right?
Well, I think everybody has to pay some kind of fine, but we don't usually impose monetary penalties, except we require lawyers to pay back,
right?
You know, their
if
clients.
They took, right,
yes,
of course.
Right, yes.
And it mentioned, the article further mentioned, I hope these figures are correct, but this is what I saw online. It mentioned that currently there are 576 disbarred or suspended lawyers, but people really need to keep that in context, don't they? Because there are 25,000 lawyers practicing in Minnesota. So the number of lawyers who end up before you or before the Office of Professional Responsibility for Misconduct is actually quite small compared to the number of lawyers practicing. Isn't that true?
I mean, I think that's a really, really important point to make, that our bar in Minnesota is really, really, for the most part, almost everybody is well qualified. They're competent. We have really good lawyers in Minnesota, and they act ethically and do the right thing for their clients.
Starting at the ground level, our law schools teach ethics. I remember when I was going through law school, legal ethics, and then there's an exam you have to take too.
That's right.
And you have to take continuing legal education to stay current on the law and current on the ethical requirements, which can change from time to time.
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
yes.
Very good. Some judges have said, in Minnesota we have a process where our judges, district court and Supreme Court, are subject to election. I've seen some commentators have occasionally said judges shouldn't be subject to election, that that's not really appropriate, that they're supposed to be judging the law and should not be subject to really the political process of having to campaign for re-election. Aside from the fact that most judicial positions are uncontested, few exceptions, do you agree or disagree with that idea that judges should not be subject to election?
Yeah, I mean, I have mixed feelings on it, I suppose. I think elections can actually serve. I mean, I get the concern. You know, you don't want judges making decisions because they're concerned about how the public is going to react. Part of the job of judges is to protect those who, you know, those whose voices or whose positions are not popular, right? And so there's a real tension between being elected popularly and wanting to protect the rights, the individual rights of everybody. Those things are in tension sometimes. So so that's a risk. I don't think that really happens. I don't think judges think about it in Minnesota that way. Now, we see some other states around us that have become much more politicized. But on the other hand, there's a real risk, I think, with lifetime appointments, that judges get too separated from the people and from the everyday kind of ongoing life of Minnesotans.
And that may undermine the public's confidence in the judiciary.
Yes. And their ability to do their job.
If they feel judges are detached, too detached.
I think so. I think there's this real tension that you have to balance there. And so I think ultimately, I think the answer is we have to have the right norms in place. Like judges have to, even though they can politicize things, we shouldn't.
I want to ask you further about that politicization of the judiciary, because we see it happening at the federal level. We've heard news stories about this. If you look at some recent ratings of the U.S. Supreme Court, public approval ratings have fallen significantly, especially in light of a few recent decisions, Dobbs' decision overturning Roe v. Wade and a few others. Do you sense at all that the same thing is happening at the state level in our state courts? Not just Minnesota, but as you look among your colleagues in other state Supreme Courts?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think so, and I have, a couple of ideas, but we do have some data from national State Courts Association that says state courts still have a higher kind of level of confidence, public confidence, than even the federal courts do now. So that's been staying, but there's certain, it also has been going down, and it's going down more among certain communities in our state that we have to be very concerned about. And so, on the other hand, I think our judges do a very good job in Minnesota of staying away from the political stuff. Our court works very hard to, we're unanimous in our opinions probably 70-75% of the time. So we work hard on collegiality. So
it's a very collegial atmosphere,
yes.
and you usually are in agreement, but not always.
Yeah, and we come from different, political perspectives.
And speaking of politics, we just saw next door in Wisconsin what seemed to be a very politicized race for a seat on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And there's been, a lot of political events happening next door in Wisconsin that people have looked at and thought, is that going to be happening in our state? Are we going to be seeing that anytime soon? What do you think?
Well, I don't. One, I think the Judicial Selection Commission process helps a great deal. And secondly, I think Wisconsin makes one big mistake, which is that they have their judicial elections in the spring without anything else on the ballot. And so it's the only place that all the money and energy can go into. Ours are at the same time the legislature's up, the governor, the senator, or Congress. I think that kind of cushions us against some of that, because a lot of those races in Wisconsin, it's not the judges' money that's being, it's outside
groups.
Money, interest groups, yes.
And isn't there a real danger if we start to see our courts as merely political institutions? It's going to undermine confidence, and ultimately, it sort of feeds this concern about danger to our democracy. If the judicial branch of government is seen as compromised, and people lose their faith in the ability of judges to deliver justice.
That is 100% true, and I think where the biggest concern we have right now is there are some communities in Minnesota more than others that don't trust our courts to deliver justice, and we need to pay a lot of attention to that.
Maybe because of historical inequities.
Because of historical inequities, which affect courts and the criminal justice system, civil justice system, just like it affects everything else in America.
And for many people, they may form their impression of the judiciary based on their one experience in a courtroom, how a judge treated them, how their case was handled. So very important.
That's right. Yes.
Justice Paul Thissen of the Minnesota Supreme Court, thank you so much for being our guest today on Access to Democracy and giving us some further insight into your work and your background and experience. We thank you for your service on behalf of all of us in Minnesota.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. This is fun.
And we hope to have you back again someday soon.
All right. Thank you.